Oh, scary terminal stuff going on. So terrifying. Oh my goodness. I'm playing. Let's get into it.
Hello everyone, my name is Nathan. Welcome to the channel in which I will hopefully be discussing my brand new indie video game that I've been trying to code for at least about a month or maybe about two now even. Geez, time really flies. Um, but the game is called Galactic Inc. and it follows a little green squid in space whose name is Squidimus. Kudos to my friend Xavier for naming him, by the way. But it follows this little squid in space that goes from planet to planet. It's a little bit of a just a 2D Mario-esque kind of a game where, you just hop around and you have fun, right? The game itself has a bunch of features. Everything that you're seeing on screen right now was coded by me in straight C++. No engines here were used at all. Screw Unity, screw whatever. Coded this in our own game engine, created in C++, as I said, and everything's just from scratch, all the textures, everything with inspiration from my friends, of course. So thank you so much to them for that. But enough yapping and enough introductions and everything. In today's video, I want to primarily try and add in sort of like these pushing stones that you sometimes get in Pokemon or something like that, that you need strength in order to move them. I just want to add something like that to the game so that way Squidimus is able to interact with the environment around him, and I think it'll add to some pretty cool puzzles and everything. And on top of the puzzles, I think it'll just be nice to have him actually be able to interact with something that isn't the enemy or something like that. It's just going to make the game feel a lot more alive. This is my first ever game dev log. I saw these a lot on other YouTube channels and everything like that, and I just thought it would be really cool to start one myself. I also know that I can't make everything perfect myself, so if anybody out there has any cool ideas maybe for the game that they want to add in, please comment it down below, and there's a pretty high chance I'll probably actually add it into the game and make it another YouTube video or something like that, maybe. I don't know. Um, but essentially, let's go ahead and actually get into sort of what I want and what implementing that might look like.
All right, now that we are in the very professional lab, essentially what I want to happen is I want the character to be able to move, and I want the blocks to be able to detect a collision with the character, at which point they're going to go into the stasis where they're going to be able to move together, and the character is going to be able to push the block. I also want for the character to be able to push the blocks off of a ledge and have them fall down. I want them to essentially have their own form of gravity and be able to interact with blocks around them. So stacking them like this, the second one is going to fall down and hit the floor. I also want it so that way if they're just raised randomly or whatever for whatever reason, they're also going to fall down and hit the floor essentially. This means that we're going to need to implement proper collision systems as well as proper gravity systems for each of the block in place, something that is going to take a long time. Let's get to it. Alrighty, so the first thing that I was make all of the textures for both the animation of Squidimus pushing the block as well as the actual block itself. I decided on two animations for Squidimus, the first one being an idle push, the second one being a walking push, essentially. The box itself was just a really basic, just crate sort of a thing that I made in A-Sprite. Shout out to A-Sprite, really love A-Sprite. Um, but in the background right here, I'm essentially coding the logic. So the first thing that I had to do, I already had a system to set up entities, so that was, that wasn't too bad. But I had to detect all of the collisions between the player and the possible movable objects. Now, the physics system that my game uses follows something called axis aligned bounding boxes, or AABB, which essentially just detects overlap between two bounding boxes that are drawn on the screen, or not necessarily drawn on the screen, but that are within of the entity, and detects a collision between them. Now, by doing this, I was also able to then check if the entity that the player was colliding with was in fact a movable block, and if it was, then I stored a pointer of that block. And essentially, I'm using shared pointers here. The entities themselves are classes, but the the shared entity pointer essentially just means that entity, right? So I was able to store this shared entity pointer into a single function, not a function actually, into a single variable within a my scene class, after which I was able to do things with it, right? So now that I had this, I would basically essentially try to set the movable entity to be on the same x-axis and the same y-axis as the player, but only with a slight offset in the x-axis. That way it looked as though it was in front or behind the player. However, obviously this caused for a strange thing to happen where the block would be following the player even after they had turned around. However, this was obviously anticipated, and I had later written a function that checked if the player was still facing that direction, and if they weren't, then the block was no longer that black, and I could send the null pointer to be set as the variable in the scene function for the current block that was being held. Now, after having done all of this, I needed to actually implement collisions between the block and other blocks. Now, I had found that I actually could not do a collision between the player and the pushable block itself because then it wouldn't be able to move. However, I then had to write a whole separate function, not really, a whole separate for loop in order to find each one of the blocks that the current block could be colliding with and then stop those exact collisions. This worked out very well actually, and I was able to get a block that was colliding with other blocks. Now the hard part here was actually adding in gravity. Now by adding in gravity, what I had to do was add a constant downward velocity to each of the blocks that was considered movable. Now I was able to do this rather easily in my sMovement function. However, it caused a large amount of issue in my collision function because the blocks were being constantly moved downward. They were constantly colliding with the blocks below them. Now, this sounds like the correct thing that should have been happening. However, the issue is that I was unable to resolve collisions that were happening below the blocks as well as happening right next to them at the same time. This means that the blocks would not move whenever they were pushed, and instead I had to find some sort of a way to not constantly apply gravity. Now, what I found out that I should have been doing, which I'm very surprised it took me this long to figure it out, but I essentially had to do this thing where I took the bounding box of a block and then I set it down by a single pixel. After doing this, I was running the calculation twice, which was far more expensive, but what I was able to find out is if that shifted overlapping box did in fact detect a collision, that means that I was on the ground and therefore I could not apply gravity. However, if I was not on the ground, what had to happen was obviously applying the gravity, right? That block, or excuse me, that bounding box would not detect a collision and I would be able to go until it did. And then I would be able to actually properly resolve each of the collisions that would happen between the blocks. And this honestly worked surprisingly well. I was able to implement the feature in only just about a day, and everything worked out pretty smoothly. I'm honestly pretty happy with this thing, but I feel like it adds a lot to the game and it's a pretty fun little mechanic. But that being said, here it is working live and all cool and everything. All right, so that was my first ever YouTube video. If anybody liked it, I don't know, subscribe, engage, whatever. I don't really care if you do. I'm just kind of doing this for fun. If you have any ideas, put them right in the comments. I'll definitely be looking. But yeah, so far, first ever YouTube video, first ever devlog done. Hopefully everything goes good. I hope everyone has an amazing day, and I'll see you all later. See ya.